Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and how are you doing today? I really hope you're having a very nice day. Continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, if you don't mind, I would like to take this opportunity to talk with you over the next few moments or so about a very interesting and suspenseful, and even now quite effective chiller of a film that was made for television, and it was originally broadcast in 1978, but we are very lucky to be able to watch it now. The film is Someone's Watching Me. So this is the film that John Carpenter directed, and it was shown on network television, so it was a made-for-TV film broadcast in 1978. But I think due to the logistics, if you will, of films that were made for television and broadcast on network television in the late 70s and early 80s, etc., I think that accounts for the fact that this film for the longest time was very difficult to watch. I, in fact, remember having to see it for the first time on a kind of bootleg VHS tape rental. And so, and it wasn't very good quality, and I didn't quite fully appreciate, I think, the great skill and craft that really is at play in this film. And so I'm very grateful to the fine people at Scream Factory, Shout Factory and Scream Factory, for being able to release this film on Blu-ray. So now it's very readily accessible, I think. And that's wonderful too, because this is a surprisingly effective film. And the fact also that, well, it should be known that in terms of the release filmography of films directed by John Carpenter, and of course this film is included in that filmography, this film comes after Halloween, because Halloween, as I understand it, was initially released in October 1978, and then this film, Someone's Watching Me, was initially broadcast on television in November 1978. However, the film Someone's Watching Me was actually made prior to Halloween. So in that respect, the film Someone's Watching Me can be seen in many ways as being a kind of setting up of tropes that we will see in Halloween. It's almost a prototype for many aspects that we will come to know very well in the film Halloween. So in that respect, and these are things that hopefully I can try to get into later in this video, but in that general sweep, I think this film is very significant in John Carpenter's filmography. It is also significant because it is his first so-called studio film, in the sense that the films that he made prior to this, Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13, were sort of independent productions, and here we are talking about bigger studio network television production. And so he was dealing behind the scenes with pretty big names in terms of network television and episodic television in the United States. So this is in many ways a film, and John Carpenter in fact acknowledges this in many of the supplemental materials here, that in many ways this film was the one where he learned his craft. He learned a lot of things. He learned how to be a professional filmmaker in many respects, and it's great. It's absolutely great. So in that sense, I think this can be seen as a starting point, if you will, for many of the things to come in John Carpenter's future films. But besides all that, I think it is, much more directly, a film that is quite tense, quite jarring, very interesting in terms of the narrative twists and turns that it takes. To make the film stand on its own quite boldly, and I think it stands on its own very confidently in the context of John Carpenter's filmography. So, in fact, while it can be seen to be a precursor, if you will, to Halloween, at the same time, it holds its own quite remarkably well. And also, I should point out, in very general terms, the subject matter, right? It's about a young single woman who is living on her own, and she's moved to Los Angeles, and she is being stalked from afar by this unknown stalker, and by telephone calls and sending presents and letters that grow ever so menacing and threatening as the film progresses. And so it's essentially her story of trying to resolve the situation, trying to stop her stalker before things go way out of hand, and thus creates the sort of mystery element, the suspenseful element to this film. And believe me, there is a lot of suspense, a lot of surprises that are to be had here in a very interesting way. And that's something that I'd like to get to in the second part of this video. Therefore, with all these elements in mind, and the fact that for the longest time it was made unavailable, it's so wonderful to see this film released in this 2K restoration release that we see in the Scream Factory Blu-ray, which I have here. Really wonderful, and I strongly recommend it. You are going to get not only a great John Carpenter film, but such a thrilling entertainment. This is a fun, entertaining, and at times somewhat scary and creepy film. But it's so fascinating to watch, and it's held together at its center by the great performance by Lauren Hutton as Lee Michaels, one of the great heroes of John Carpenter's works as a whole. She really stands on her own, and she makes her mark in the Carpenter cinematic world. And that's all thanks in large part to Lauren Hutton's great, grounded, very likable performance as Lee. And it's something that I will try to get into later in this video. So that's that. But the interesting thing about this Scream Factory Blu-ray, which I strongly recommend that you get if you haven't already gotten it, is that not only is it the presentation of this film that has been up to now somewhat difficult to get one's hands on, and not only is it a 2K presentation of this film, but you also have new interviews with Charles Cyphers and Adrienne Barbeau, and these are two actors that we will see later in many other works by John Carpenter, so they figure in quite prominently. Charles Cyphers we actually saw earlier in the film Assault on Precinct 13, and so this interview with Charles Cyphers is actually a great, nice overview of his career with respect to John Carpenter and outside. Really lovely interview. And then, of course, Adrienne Barbeau is an actor who figures in quite significantly in John Carpenter's filmography and also his personal life. And so this is where they met. And it's lovely to see Adrienne Barbeau tell the story about her acting and her career up to this point, and how John Carpenter and her work with him affected her acting, and it's really lovely to see. And she says that John Carpenter gave her a lot of interesting and helpful advice with respect to her own acting, which she then was able to use throughout her career. And what a fantastic career it is. So it's great to see Adrienne Barbeau speak about how they met and what happened during the filming, and of course what happened after the filming. So it's such an insightful and warm interview that Adrienne Barbeau gives here. It's available here. Really lovely. And then there is a short documentary called John Carpenter, Director Rising. And this is a short documentary which I think John Carpenter is shown on camera to be interviewed, and he's talking about the significance of this film, Someone's Watching Me, in the context of this of his career. And he does talk about certain techniques that he used in Someone's Watching Me, which he later employs in Halloween. To great effect. And believe me, the techniques that he uses in Someone's Watching Me are so effective, and some of them are really, they get under the skin in a somewhat creepy and eerie way. And so it's really lovely to hear him speak about this film, and he speaks very fondly and warmly, and he looks upon this film with a great deal of fondness. It's so evident just from listening to him speak. So I think that alone is worth the admission in terms of watching the supplement here. So it's called John Carpenter, Director Rising. And then there are TV promos here, which are very interesting. But I must say that the best supplement that is included here, and in fact I would dare say that it's one of the best commentary tracks that I've heard in a long time, is the commentary track by Amanda Reyes. And Amanda Reyes is the author of the book Are You in the House Alone? A TV Movie Compendium, 1964 to 1999. And she gives a rich, dense, packed commentary. It's just her by herself, but she's talking about the film as a kind of expert in US TV films. She is also very well spoken about US horror films. She also knows a lot about John Carpenter's filmography, and she has read so many things, and to the point where she is packing this commentary with so much information, so much knowledge, so many references to books, magazines, biographies, other television films that are relevant, the network TV scheduling at the time that this was shown, the impact that this had in terms of TV viewership, ratings, and she's also talking about the film in the context of its content. In terms of the male gaze and voyeurism, and the links to Hitchcock and Howard Hawks, but not only that, also to H.P. Lovecraft, and the importance and significance of certain crew members that John Carpenter worked with on this film, that provide links to the past of TV episode directors and musicians and the like, and also other tidbits about the sort of trivia tidbits about this film, etc. And she brings in other references to other horror films, and then along the way she brings in her own love of the film. I mean, there are some moments where she just stops in her tracks and she just looks at the film as we're watching it, and then she just marvels at how wonderful this is. So again, this is Amanda Reyes, her commentary track for Someone's Watching Me. It is one of the most entertaining and informative commentary tracks to a film that I think I've ever seen. So it's very, very recommended. And it's very low key. She is not in any way talking like a sort of stuffy academic type, as it were. She's very down to earth in terms of her tone and what she's trying to convey. And she also is, and I think this is so important, which is what makes her commentary track so great, you can tell immediately that she is so in love with this work. She loves this film very much, and she knows every single detail. It's incredible. So I cannot stress enough how lovely I think the commentary track that is included on the Scream Factory release here is. It's just lovely. Again, that's Amanda Reyes' commentary track to Someone's Watching Me, John Carpenter's TV movie from 1978. Okay, so with that in mind, my friends, let me now say that I will now talk about this film with a little bit of detail. So if you haven't seen this film yet, please stop this video and try to watch this film, Someone's Watching Me. And after you've seen this film, you can come back to this video at any time, because it'll still be here, and we can talk in detail with a lot of spoilers. I'm going to talk about the ending as well, so I don't want to spoil this if you haven't seen it yet. So please, if you haven't seen it, please stop this video, and when you have, you can come back at any time, my dear friends, at which time it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts and comments about this great, scary film, Someone's Watching Me. Okay, so you're back, so which means that I can assume that you have seen Someone's Watching Me. And I should point out from the outset that we have here a film that is, it's, I think, a gem. It is a real gem. And it's a film that I find works so well on its own. I alluded to earlier in the video the fact that I think a lot of things and a lot of visual tricks and camera movement and narrative things that occur in this film might be seen to be precursors, if you will, to the film Halloween, or another way to put that would be elements that we see at work in this film will appear later in the film Halloween. So, for example, the way the camera seems to glide through the apartment, through Lee's apartment, it represents almost the way in which the camera work will be used. For example, the very start of Halloween with the Myers house, or Lee Michaels as a character, the Lauren Hutton character, the way she is presenting herself seems almost reminiscent of Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis's character. I mean, all the way down to certain details, like at one point, Lee, we see her emerge from the elevator, and she's singing a song about she mispronounces the name of Mr. Frimpkin, but that is reminiscent of the way in which Laurie Strode was singing as she was walking down the street, and Michael Myers is watching her from a distance. So, and they have this strength of character that still it shows certain moments of vulnerability, and when the characters are under a tremendous amount of stress because they're both being pursued. Here we are shown that the Lee Michaels character is being pursued from afar in a quite menacing and very creepy way. And the same is true also, of course, for Laurie Strode in Halloween. But those are just a few examples, I think, of how this film will seem to echo certain things, or Halloween will repeat certain aspects of this film. But I think this film stands so strongly on its own 2 feet within the realm of John Carpenter's filmography. From the outset, we see, I think, such a love of the Hollywood past, and also of science fiction and fantasy and horror, and that sort of thing. So what do I mean by this? Well, from the outset, we see so many homages, linkages to the past of, for instance, Alfred Hitchcock. There are so many scenes that are reminiscent of, for example, Rear Window, when we have this idea of using a telescope to look through, look at the room on the opposite side of the street there. In this case, we do get POV shots of the stalker, right, who is looking through this long telescope thing and spying in on Lee in her apartment. We also get the reverse, of course, when the stalker sends Lee the telescope, and then she puts it together and she starts to look at the opposite side there. And then slowly, as the film progresses, they realize that whoever is stalking Lee must be doing it from the other building across the way, a Blake Tower. That's another interesting allusion to something else we'll get to in a second, because she lives in, Arkham Tower, and then the building across the street is Blake Tower. There's also a bar called Marcus, and things like that, which I'll get to in a second. But my point is that there are scenes which are very reminiscent of Rear Window, and using the lens to see out to the rooms across the street there. And Lauren Hutton, therefore, is our hero. So she is she has this way of speaking, and she's like someone almost like out of a Howard Hawks film, as it were. And she is in the mold, as I say, of these strong characters that we have seen in John Carpenter's filmography before, and that we will see later in his filmography. So characters like Lee in Assault on Precinct 13 comes to mind immediately. Also in future works. Adrienne Barbeau's character in The Fog, also Kim Cattrall's character in Big Trouble in Little China. They are they come to mind almost immediately. But she is like a Howard Hawks character. She's also like the Jimmy Stewart character, and she's also like the Grace Kelly character, all rolled into one. And that, I think, further solidifies the link to Rear Window, I think, very strikingly. Also, Adrienne Barbeau as the character Sophie, who is such a great secondary character, and she gives the film such life, and she is so down to earth and very memorable because of the way she is depicted. And of course, there is this very interesting way in which her sexuality, the character's sexuality, is being dealt with, because as far as I understand it, this was one of the earliest examples on U.S. network television of an openly gay character being depicted in this way, and it's done in a way that her sexuality is not necessarily something that is brought to the fore, but it's just an aspect of her character that is revealed early on in the film when they first meet, in fact, and then it's never dealt with in any direct way. In other words, her sexual orientation does not in any way seem to figure in directly to the direct events of the narrative, which I find to be a very interesting choice. And according to the commenter, this was a very almost revolutionary thing in terms of network television and the depiction of Sophie's character in this way. So this is a lovely performance, I think, by Adrienne Barbeau. She even has a kind of the way she talks is so likable, and she reminds me in a way of Thelma Ritter's character in Rear Window, and I think that adds another dimension of connection, if you will, with Hitchcock. But Rear Window is not the only source of reference there. Of course, at the very outset, after the opening credit sequence, we get the opening credits, or the pre-credit sequence, we get the opening credits, and it's the red with the lines, which is very reminiscent, of course, of Saul Bass, and the lines are they're making parallel and perpendicular lines across the way with a large, bombastic score. Which is really a lovely score. Harry Sukman, who is a very famous, or was a very famous musician and for television and film, so he provides a score which is like an homage to Bernard Herrmann, and of course the Saul Bass-esque type of credits there, very reminiscent of North by Northwest. So we have another link here. But what I love about this film, and I think the commentary by Amanda Reyes points this out very, very astutely, is that while we have these homages, or with this homage to Hitchcock, and in particular North by Northwest, which is, if you know the film, you know it's a really larger than life action adventure thriller that goes from one part of the country and ends up in another part of the country. So it's this across the country chase, if you will. It's very grand. It's very epic in scope. But television is, rather at the time anyway, television, rather than trying to mimic this epicness of scope of cinema, which, in many respects, at least at this time, 1978, one could argue that television really could not compete in this department with film. So rather than try to go big with cinema, this film, being a made-for-TV movie, seems to go more for the intimate. And so it's interesting that we have an homage to Hitchcock's North by Northwest here, which is very bombastic with its trumpets and its excited kinetic beats of the music. But in fact, we have this rather intimate film, set more or less in one apartment room, and then we have one character, and we don't have this madcap adventure that goes from one state to another, but it's all set within this limited space or location, and we get a lot of psychological tense scenes that deal with Lee Michaels and her characterization and how this is affecting her mentally. And so it's, in many ways, it feels like a more intimate portrayal, which is befitting the small screen, as it were, in a great way, whereas cinema is something much grander. And that's a point that Amanda Reyes brings up very nicely, and which I agree with. And so therefore we have a nice way of connecting with Hitchcock, right? On the one hand, we have this connection with Hitchcock, but on the other hand, there's an acknowledgement, if you will, maybe a tacit one at that, that this is a TV film that is going for different stakes. And there's no shame in doing that. On the contrary, I think the film goes for something different, and it succeeds quite brilliantly. But despite those differences, we still have these homages, if you will, to the cinematic past. So we have North by Northwest, we have Rear Window. There's also a very famous shot, right, after Paul spends the night with Lee, and then it's the next morning and Paul leaves, and she gets another call from the stalker, and she realizes that the stalker is seeing her. She is being watched by her, by the stalker as we speak, and so this is a big shock to her, and so she turns to the window, and then we get that dolly zoom effect. It sort of elongates her, and it's sort of the zoom in and dolly out, or reverse, I forget which, but it has that what's known as the vertigo effect, because Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock was, I think, my understanding is that was the first time that was used in a big film like that, and that was used in that film in terms of trying to mimic or replicate the feeling of dizziness that was experienced firsthand by the Jimmy Stewart character in that film. So it's known, I think, commonly as the Vertigo shot, and we've seen it used in other non-Hitchcock films. Jaws comes to mind, Goodfellas comes to mind later. Of course, Goodfellas came after this film, but it's interesting that we see it employed here, right? We don't see it. It's not used in the exact same way that Alfred Hitchcock used it in Vertigo, right? Because Vertigo used it in the point of view shot in order to show the way in which height is elongated from the Jimmy Stewart's character's point of view. Here, it's used on Lee, and we see Lee look, and then as she looks, it seems to represent her psychological stress and the point in which she realizes that she is indeed being watched at that very moment. And so its focus is on the character rather than the character's point of view, but still it is a very shocking and quite a memorable moment. So, the shot also, I think, is. I should point out that that Alfred Hitchcock used that same effect in the film Marnie in a very stylized way. So perhaps the way in which Alfred Hitchcock employed that camera technique in Marnie might be seen as being one that is not necessarily dissimilar. In fact, there are probably stronger connections with the use of the dolly zoom in Marnie and this film rather than Vertigo in this film, although I think the psychological effects with either film, I think generally speaking, are in the same ballpark. But that being said, let me say that yes, that is another example, I think, of a connection to Hitchcock. There are other connections to other sources of sort of a cinematic past or a horror past. I want to mention briefly there are instances of connections, whether they're purposeful or not. I want to say that they are purposeful. In fact, Amanda Reyes on the commentary seems to suggest that they are. So, for instance, there are references to H.P. Lovecraft. As I mentioned, there's a bar called Marcus, and also the Arkham Tower and Blake Tower. Blake Tower is referencing a character. Also, the idea here is that there are references that we will see in other John Carpenter films, and in particular the way in which the characters are named. So For instance, Lee, the main character Lee, Lauren Hutton's character Lee. Now she is, she could be saying, maybe she is named after Lee Brackett. Maybe it's an homage to Janet Leigh. Or maybe it's something else. But again, this is a name that we've seen before, Lee, in Assault on Precinct 13. And we also see Sheriff Brackett later in Halloween. And we've acknowledged too that at least he is his character is revealed to be called Lee Brackett, and so there's that. Also, Blake Tower I mentioned before, right? But Blake can also be seen. We see the name Blake being used later if you know The Fog, and we will get to the film The Fog as well. There's also reference at the very outset of the film to another woman that the stalker seems to have been stalking, and her name is Elizabeth Solly. And we find out later in the film, or at least maybe in the first half of the film, through a television broadcast, that there was a nurse named Elizabeth Solly who committed suicide. And I think we later can infer that the stalker maybe had something to do with her death, Elizabeth Solly's death. Maybe it wasn't necessarily suicide. And I think Paul maybe starts to put two and two together. He's sort of like he kind of acts like a detective in this film, but although not really, which is something I want to get to in a second. But my point is that Elizabeth Solly is the name of the character that Jamie Lee Curtis plays in The Fog, and so that's an interesting little connection that we will see later. So, and I mean, even at the very end, and Amanda Reyes also points this out as well, which is really nice. The stalker himself, the character's name is Herbert Stiles, and when we actually see him at last, at the very, very end of the film, he's wearing a sort of black jumpsuit that makes him look almost like Michael Myers, and his face, there's almost plainness, if you will, to his face. He has a sort of blank look on his face, which could be seen as being reminiscent of the mask in Halloween as worn by the Shape in that film. So very interesting. And Lee Michaels, of course, her last name is Michaels, Michael Myers and stuff. So I think we can play this game a lot, and we've seen this recurring a lot with many films in John Carpenter's work. So this isn't any exception to that, I think. This is still very much a consistently John Carpenter film in that respect. But going into the actual film itself, what can we say about this really challenging and remarkable work? I think we can start with the great character of Lee Michaels, as played by Lauren Hutton, who I must say just gives such a great performance. And it's really remarkable too, because according to the commentary here anyway, Lauren Hutton was essentially still trying to transition into an acting career from her earlier modeling career. And so it was, I think she gives a great performance, because she's, from the outset, I think, very likable. She's shown to be very, she's kind of witty, and you can see this in her opening scene with Leone, the real estate guy who's showing her the apartment, 4320, and she has that way of speaking to herself, which I admit it's very charming. It has a kind of TV sitcom-like feel to it because she's by herself, and I think as a narrative tool, that's a great way to reveal information to us. And so, I mean, I think most immediately when she's going out to her first job interview, we see her talking to herself and trying to pretend to respond to questions that she imagines that she will be asked during her job interview. And I should point out, when she drives to her job interview, she's driving and she's still talking to herself in the car, and the way that the windshield wipers go back and forth, it reminds me of Janet Leigh driving in Psycho. So that's another Hitchcock reference, I think. But my point here is that she is a character that is, I think, on the one hand, seems to be a kind of almost like a sitcom-like character, a TV sitcom-like character in the way she talks to herself. And she comes into this large apartment where it feels like almost like a set of a TV show almost. But I mean, those are, I think, the interesting aspects of this film as a made-for-TV film on the one hand. But on the other hand, there is a lot of life to her performance, and there are a lot of memorable things. For instance, and she speaks like a Howard Hawks character. I think there's a line she says after she meets Paul, and she gets a little bit maybe distracted. She says, this is very typical. I'm paraphrasing. The first moment you meet a guy and you're all toes, or something like that, and. She talks about her mother and her appendicitis, and she talks about kind of joking about what her situation is, and she is very confident, and even when she is trying to, when men are trying to pick her up, basically, she very confidently and yet politely just brushes them aside. And so she seems to know, in one sense anyway, she seems to know what she wants to do, at least in the immediate future, right? Which she wants to try to succeed in this new place with her new job. And I think that's very admirable. And also she has a certain confidence about her, which is very... I find very appealing, and also it helps to explain why she is not willing to let the stalker affect her, right? She is not willing to move out immediately, but rather she wants to stay, and she wants to fight it out, right? And she does this in a really brave way. I mean, there are two instances, I think, in particular, where her character is quite brave. When she goes into the apartment for the first time, and not the first time, but she goes into the apartment after she comes back from the TV studio, and she finds that the door was open. She goes in, and really, there could have been someone, and there was actually someone in the room, as we find out, but she didn't know it at the time. But she goes in and she says something like, I know karate, or something like. So it's kind of a half joke, but also it's a way of disarming the atmosphere, and it's also, I think, a very brave move. And it's something that she kind of repeats at the very end, at the climax, when she's in the room by herself, and she realizes that someone else is in the room, and so she talks just to get the attention of Styles, who's actually in there. And so, I mean, the fact that she's talking aloud is really quite brave, and I think it goes also to the way in which speech is very important to this character of Lee Michaels. It seems to be, in many ways, a means by which she is almost being empowered, right? When she talks a lot to herself in the beginning, she's talking about her situation, what she wants to do, what she's imagining what will happen with her career or something like that. And I think in many respects it's her trying to create her own story. And that's very interesting to think about too, because as the film progresses, with the telephone calls getting more frequent and more sinister, and the plot developing in terms of who is stalking her, what the heck is going on here with her situation, the moments of her talking by herself, they tend to diminish and dwindle, and so she's not seeing talking as much by herself. So it's almost as though the threat of Styles, the stalker, is so much so that it's almost robbing her of her ability to speak, right? Which is, I know it's not directly so, because obviously she still speaks to other characters as the film progresses, but my point is that her inner monologue speeches, as you will, tend to be almost non-existent at the high points there, but they come back at the very end. In fact, at the very end, when Styles falls through the window into his death, and the camera goes to the wonderful windy close-up of Lauren Hutton, she actually gives one final line, and so that's her. And a very interesting way, her reclaiming her right to provide inner monologues, if you will. And so I find that aspect of her character and the way it's presented and combined with Lauren Hutton's performance to be utterly compelling. And connected with that too, it's the character's relationship with men throughout this film is equally compelling. You know, the commentary, as I said, I think very astutely points to this idea of the male gaze and the objectification of the women characters via the male gaze, making reference, quite rightly so, to Laura Mulvey, etc. But the point here is that it's very interesting to see the Lee Michaels character interact with the various male characters in this film. Of course, we have the stalker, Robert Stiles, who is very directly so trying to threaten her and trying to impose himself upon her, and really trying to, in the most upfront way, objectifying her to no end. Well, the end, unfortunately, will be in the climactic scene where her very life is being threatened, of course. So I guess the end is death. But I suppose one can say that, yes, he is the one who is ultimately objectifying her, and he's ultimately subjecting her to his gaze, right? Of course, through the telescope, etc. So I think that character, the stalker character, is the one who is, who is the ultimate threatening voyeur in that sense. But he's not the only one who is subjecting Lee Michaels to one's gaze. I mean, the various male characters that we meet, Leone, the real estate guy, Steve, the TV studio who tries to pick her up, and various other sorts of instances like this. But I think those are the two direct ones. They seem to have a sense, at least in certain ways, of that their characters are treated in close-up, etc. They're trying to. They see her as a potential. How should I put it? They want to date her, perhaps, or they want to do something with her. Maybe less so Leone, because he doesn't really express it in verbal terms. But you can kind of tell in the way that he looks at her. But Steve, I think more directly so, because you actually see him try to pick her up, try to invite her on dates, but she casually refuses his advances, of course. And also we see her being approached by an unknown person at the bar, at a restaurant bar, and then she politely rebuffs. But then immediately after that, she then turns the tables, and then she approaches who we will, the character who we will later know to be Paul, and then that will be the beginning of their relationship. And she expresses that her immediate attraction to this man sitting at the table, or the bar there, who is Paul. So that's very, very interesting depiction, right? On the one hand, she seems to be trying to resist these attempts at subjecting her by these other characters to the male gaze. And then at the same time, via her interaction with Paul, she seems to be wanting to play the role of the actor, if you will, the one that commences with the action, rather than the one that is being subjected to the objectification. And so I find that to be a very compelling depiction of this character. I mean, is this the most is this the ultimate depiction of a kind of feminist hero, if you will? I'm not going so far to say that, because my expertise with this kind of discussion, I admit, is not very strong. So I'm not very well equipped to have a full discussion about that. So I apologize about that. But just on a very general level, I think we are dealing with a strong character that is at once trying to resist objectification, but at the same time also trying to become a kind of actor in her own right, and being able to make choices in her own right. I mean, it's very interesting too, even in her relationship with Paul, which is probably in many ways one of the healthier relationships that she is encountering within the context of this film. There's that moment at the beginning there when they're walking out and it's nighttime, and then she asks him, guess what I do for a living, and he says, fashion model or something. So it's almost like he has an almost innate expectation of what she does, which is in many ways can be seen from a certain point of view anyway to be a kind of a role where one is designed to be at the subject of the objectification, right? Namely, the model, right? The model works to be seen, right? To be the subject of the gaze, which is, I think, fascinating too, because right, we know that her character is not one that is in front of the camera, but works behind the camera. She doesn't know, though, that she is actually being in front of the camera as we speak, because Styles is obviously looking at them as they're walking. So he is already stalking them. So she is actually working in front of the camera. She is trying to be behind the camera. So I think that's another interesting dynamic. She wants to forge her own future, but it's almost like the stalking and her being subjected to the gaze are almost forcing her into a different arena altogether, and that's an amazing complex dynamic there. But Paul's initial impression of Lee, I think, isn't fully, how shall I put it, without any kind of scrutiny, if you will, or the potential for scrutiny in the context of this kind of discussion, which makes his character very interesting. I think also we can extend this further too, right? Because all throughout this film is essentially Lee trying to find out what's going on with her life. And what I love, though, is that there are scenes where she is the one who is actively trying to seek out what's going on. Remember when she gets the note about how her stalker will be in the basement? Well, it's she who goes down to the basement with a knife, I think, trying to figure out what's going on, and she is, in a sense, in the hunter position, although her being stalked would obviously make her be in the subjected, hunted position. It's interesting that in that way, the tables are, in a small way anyway, turn where she becomes the hunter in a very base way of describing it. And so she is actively trying to figure out what's going on rather than be pursued the entire time. It's a fascinating way in which this kind of role-playing turns out. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, of course, we're dealing with this stalker who seems to be almost omnipresent. He seems to know almost everything that's going on, and he seems to know exactly what to do next in order to avoid being caught. I mean, all the way to the point where he is able to get the wrong person, Uncle Leo, right, from Seinfeld, right? Be framed, essentially. So in fact, the stalker here is very almost omnipresent. So perhaps Lee is fighting an uphill battle that she cannot, or maybe the odds are really stacked against her. But my point is that there are moments where she is really expressing her own strength of will in these very stressful situations. It's also depicted in very little scenes too. For instance, we see her fiddling with machinery at maybe the first half of the film. So we know that she is very good with tinkering with electronics, and she's very quick to assemble the telescope together. She's very quick to recognize the little bug under the desk when when the desk falls or the thing falls from under the desk, and she kind of can identify it as a kind of recorder of some kind, a bug device. So she knows these things. So it's not like she is in any way stupid. I think I love the fact that she is presented here as thinking. She is also trying to figure out what's going on, and she's also knowledgeable of the fact that she realizes the importance of not letting this affect her. and affect her way of life and affect her well-being. Of course, it does take a huge toll on her, and we see this in her face and in her manner and the way in which Lauren Hutton infuses life into this character so gracefully. And we see the effects of this, of course, but I think my point is that she, as a character, is trying to fend off this threat to her life in the strongest way she is able to, which is in a very forthright, very active way, rather than a so-called passive way. And I admire that greatly. I find this to be a great central performance and one of the great memorable characters in John Carpenter's filmography. I should point out also that what's interesting, therefore, is that I think the film, the way it presents this story, I think it could have gone either way. It could have gone actually many ways. It could have been like a mystery thriller, right? Who is the stalker, right? And we had, I think, a lot of characters that we meet in the film. Leonie, Steve, the guy who lives across the street, maybe the doorman, the Paul, right? Sophie, right? And I think the film, set itself up in many ways to be a film that maybe wanted us to guess who was the stalker. And so I admit, when I first saw the film, I was thinking, oh, maybe Paul is the bad guy, or maybe Paul and Sophie are in cahoots or something like that, which is explain why Sophie maybe faked her own death or something. I don't know. I was thinking of all these scenarios in my mind as I was watching this film, but it was actually kind of a pleasant surprise to realize that none of those scenarios was the actual case. But in fact, this film was a straightforward kind of stalker thriller. And when we finally see Herbert Stiles at the very end, we never really saw him until we saw little glimpses and shadows and maybe things like that, but we never saw a full close-up of his face until the very end, when he's stabbed with the glass shard there, just before he falls through the window. But I think I think that was a really pleasant surprise for me, because I was actually expecting that this would be a really super twisty thriller where Paul is the killer or something like that. But that wasn't the case at all. And so I was glad to see that we had a more simpler, a finely focused film, which meant that we could therefore focus our attention on the way in which the psychological stress is impacting Lee as a character, and the way in which Lee has been set up, the way in which her character has been established, and the strengths and weaknesses of her let me say the strengths and weaknesses, but the personality, the type of personality and character that she has, as painted by the performance by Lauren Hutton. And therefore, the simplicity of the narrative allows us, upon watch and rewatch and further rewatch, I think, to give us more of an examination of Lee as a character, which then augments and enhances these discussions that I was trying to allude to earlier with respect to the gaze and how the male gaze is affecting her, or how she is trying to fight back, or she is trying to resist, and she's trying to make it on her own, as it were, or with her own resolve. So therefore, this plot and the narrative and its themes, I think, serve each other mutually to great benefit. I think it's the more I think about it, the more complex and rich I realize that this film is. So I think it's really great. I mean, granted, there are certain things that I think are a little bit peculiar. For instance, I mean, she, as a character, she likes to keep her curtains on her windows open a lot, even at night, apparently. So perhaps it would have been, I don't know, maybe if she had closed her curtains more often, that maybe she could have avoided some trouble. Although maybe the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe what happened to her ultimately was unavoidable, and maybe even though if she had decided earlier on to close her curtains more often, maybe even with that choice, she would still have been under a great deal of peril. So maybe I should really temper my comments about that particular aspect of her character, which is a very minor point, but again, this is a TV movie, and I can understand the necessities, if you will, of propelling the narrative in this way. So I completely get that. There are other aspects of the film that I'd like to talk about just very quickly. For instance, when we first see the stalker's POV and he is looking around and he first plants eyes on Lee as she's out on the ledge there, she is still... in that scene, she's sort of unpacking and she's talking to herself, and it's her first time in LA on her own. And then she goes out into the balcony there, and then we see the POV shot of Stiles, and he's looking through the telescope there, and we can see her. We can't hear her, but we can see her, and she's still talking. I think that's a really charming moment. We can still see her talking to herself, even in that moment of the first POV on her. So. It's just another charming aspect to Lee's character, I think. Also, the climax is really quite astounding. The fact that the actress, there are shots of her actually hanging out of an actual building, and they're struggling and all that. I find that to be really admirable. And such a great choice, such a brave choice by Lauren Hutton to be willing to do that. And I also understand that, according to the commentary, Lauren Hutton expressed a little bit of disappointment with the actual ending that was used in the film, because according to her, there was going to be another ending where we would have seen more of a struggle between Lee and Stiles in those final moments, and then Stiles would have fallen out as a result of struggling with Lee, rather than what happens in the final film, which is where Lee stabs him in the back there, and we see him about to die, and then he sort of falls out on his own without Lee pushing him or anything like that. So I think Lauren Hutton had expressed a little bit of disappointment. She would have rather have seen more of a struggle. But according to Amanda Reyes, I think the powers that be had decided upon the ending that was eventually used, because had it not been that way, it wouldn't have been quote unquote ladylike. So there is a little bit of a sort of an edge there that could be said to be lost with the ending that was actually used with this film. But the way that Lauren Hutton seems to describe it, as described by Amanda Reyes in her great commentary, is really interesting and adds yet another potential layer of complexity and real intelligence to the Lee Michaels character, at least as envisioned by Lauren Hutton. Again, another indication of how great the performance is. There's a lot of things too I could get into about this film. Just a few final comments before I close this out, but there are great set pieces there. I should mention the way in which certain shots are employed. When Lee Michaels is in the basement of the building, and she has to go into that little crawl space there, and the way in which she is seen through the bars, if you will. It's almost like she's a caged animal. She was the hunter, but then she almost immediately became the hunted in that scene. It's a really great visual technique there, and adds the tension and suspense. I should also point out the way in which the police are depicted. Hunt, as played by Charles Cyphers, and the idea that I think on the one hand there's a lot to be said about at this point in time anyway, that there weren't any certain legal protections at the disposal here that would have been able to protect someone like Lee in her position, right? And I think it's made clear in how Hunt, as played by Charles Cyphers, and the police, on the one hand, they seem to be somewhat ineffectual, but I don't think, and I think the Amanda Reyes' commentary goes into that with great detail about discussing the origins of the story, how this is based on an article that was printed in a major U.S. publication about an actual stalking case, and also there were great discussions about actual other stalking cases in Hollywood, and how the laws at the time were not well equipped to protect women in these sorts of positions. And so that provides the backdrop, if you will, for this story. So on the one hand, this film can be seen as being a kind of commentary, if you will, on the ineffectiveness of the police at that time. But I don't think that kind of interpretation is 100% accurate, because there are moments in the film where we see Hunt really purposefully try to go out of his way to protect Lee, and I think this is seen in the way in which he is able to sort of act quickly when they get the guy that they think did it. The Len Lesser character, who is known as Uncle Leo on Seinfeld, he is apprehended, and he is thought to be the guy who is the stalker. And I think we later find out that Hunt chased him out of the state and will have surveillance on him over the next 6 months. So he lost his pension and all that. So that's a moment where I think the police actually went out of their way to try to protect Lee, because they thought that they got the guy who was doing the stalking, where we realize it was the wrong man. But my point is that I think on the one hand the police are being seen as being ineffectual, but on the other hand there are moments where they are trying to go out of their way to help Lee. At least Charles Cypher's character is in this film. So I think it's a very rich portrayal, if you will. In a film that is filled with many rich portrayals. So that is my roundabout way of saying that I greatly admire this film. And as much as I think that there are moments that precede Halloween, this film undoubtedly stands on its own, emphatically so. I mean, there's a reason why this film is someone's watching me, exclamation point. Yes, this film emphatically stands on its own with its own exclamation point, as it should, because it is a fine example of a suspenseful, scary, funny, witty sort of film from John Carpenter that has all the elements that we will come to know and love in John Carpenter's works. So someone's watching me. Let me just end with one of my favorite scenes in this film. And after they try to get Hunt to help them out, but Hunt expresses his inability to help them, Paul and Sophie and Lee are seen walking out of the bar, Marcus, I think, and they're a little bit drunk, and they're all happy and all that. And it's just the three of them talking, and it's dark, and we see people walk around back. At this point, we're a little bit on edge. Maybe someone in the back could be the stalker, who knows? But they're just laughing, and they're just talking about how basically they can't do anything at this moment to help the situation at all, but they're just laughing and smiling and just joking around drunk. And I find that scene to be so lovely, because it's just such a human moment. Like, what would people do in this situation of great stress, right? They just want to go out and have a drink with their friends. I think that's such a human reaction to almost anything. And it's an example of why I think John Carpenter's films are so rich and warm. And this film is no exception to that. This film is rich and warm and welcoming and exciting and thrilling and a loving homage, and also a film that stands on its own as a very clever and deep psychological thriller that is still one that is aging so well, It hasn't dated. I'm surprised as well at how this film hasn't dated. I mean, you would think that this film would be so dated in terms of the way in which its technology is used. I mean, it uses landline phones. It uses these oddly shaped, retro-looking bug devices. These huge tape recordings. And all that, and answering machines, and all that. It has all these little bits of technology that are, of course, now very, very antiquated. But it is used in a way that feels still very very relevant today. It feels very fresh, and it's the technology is still used in a way that doesn't put too much emphasis on it. And also, it's so great to see telephones used in this way. It's nice harkening back to a past where these sort of telephones were used in a very cinematic way. Perhaps that would be another way to end this. I mean, it's right. We've seen telephones used a lot in Hitchcock, Dial M for Murder, etc. But Halloween, we will see them used very effectively, very chillingly, in fact. But this again is it's interesting to see this kind of technology used in this film. It should be quaint technology. It's outdated technology, perhaps, but still, there's something about the way it's depicted in this John Carpenter film that makes it so relevant, so fresh, and still so scary and so menacing. And I think that's just a tribute to the fact that John Carpenter is such a master at his craft. So this is the great film, Someone's Watching Me. So something else, great film. If you haven't seen it, I'm assuming you have seen it if you've stuck through this video throughout this thing, as I've spoken about the ending and all that. So, but if you haven't seen it in a while, I urge you to do so, because it is a lot of fun and it really works. So, Someone's Watching Me. Okay, my friends, let me end it there, and will invite you to please share with me, please share with all of us your thoughts and comments about this film. If you have any, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. So that's it for now. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well. And please, please, please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Cheers.